Hi, and welcome to Mouse and Keyboard Event Handling. You probably have already guessed it. We will be talking about specifics when working with events that were triggered by a mouse or a keyboard. Let's start with the former. There are a couple of events that are specific to mouse movements or someone working with a mouse, to some extent also when using gestures. And we are starting with events that relate to movement of the mouse. We have an element here, and we can attach a couple of event handlers to that element. And those event handlers are triggered once the mouse pointer is moved towards, inside, and then again outside that element. I'm using a mouse icon here, not a mouse pointer, so it's better to see. So we are moving the mouse is entering the element, that's the mouse enter event, then mouse move while we are over the element, and mouse leave once we have left the element again. So we can use those three events. There are two very popular and well-known events that seem similar to mouse enter and mouse leave. They are called mouse over and mouse out. However, I prefer mouse enter and mouse leave because they do not bubble. And bubbling for mouse over, mouse out is, in my opinion, not a good idea, because a sub-element of another element does not necessarily have to be rendered inside of the parent element. So bubbling those events usually doesn't make sense or could lead to side effects. There are other types of mouse events as well. So when we click with the mouse, there is mouse down, which means we press a mouse button and hold it down. And then when we release the mouse button again, we have mouse up. And mouse down plus mouse up on the same element is something we already know. That's the click event. Why is it important that mouse down and mouse up are on the same element? Well, just imagine you have, say, two buttons. You put the mouse pointer over one button, click down the mouse, and then move the mouse to the other button, and then release the mouse button. Then you would have mouse up on the second button, but you certainly did not click the second button. So that's why click requires mouse down and mouse up on the same element. Let's use those mouse move events to show you an effect on the Globoticket main page and also show you one more trick. At the bottom, we spot the add to cart icon. Basically, it's a span and then it references a Bootstrap icons class here, bi-cart-plus-fill. So how about we select that? So we could do, let's say, button cart. And then document query selector, and the selector would be span. But then what? We can't check for whether the class property is set to something specific. We need to look for an entry in the list of classes, and that's what can be done with that syntax here. So we have the tilde and then the equal sign, and then we just look for bi-cart-plus-fill. That should give us our cart button. And now we can add event listeners because we need two. So first of all, we'd like to listen for the mouse enter event. And if the mouse pointer hovers over the cart, we'd just like to change the visual appearance. Now, I'm absolutely aware that this can be done with CSS only, but I just wanted to show you the mouse enter and later mouse leave events in action. So let's just do that. So we just access the icon and then its class list, and then we just add an extra class. I've already prepared one. It's called cart-highlight, which basically changes the color of that specific icon. And that's it. And then we do the same thing again for mouse leave. Let me just copy and paste that just to save some time. So once the mouse leaves the icon again, we remove the class we have previously added. And that's basically it. Here we go in the browser. Just have a look at the icon. the mouse pointer is approaching and the color is different. And once we leave the icon, the color is back to its original form. Very simple effect, of course, but it showed you how to put the mouse enter and mouse leave events to good use. If we attach an event listener to an element, we again get event data. For instance, which element fired that event. Since we are using mouse events, there are specifics that would not be possible with, say, a keyboard event that we can access via those event data arguments as well. And here are a few of them. I'd like to start with client X and client Y. So these are the X and Y coordinates. But the coordinates of what? Well, obviously of the position of the mouse pointer when the event was fired. And there are a few of those. So the differences are pretty important. Client X and client Y contain the coordinates relative to the current window. For instance, if you click in the top left corner within the browser window, client X and client Y will be 0 or close to 0. If you scroll horizontally or vertically and click in the top left corner, it's still 0 and 0, so that's relative to the viewport. And that's what client X and client Y contain. Page X and page Y, they contain the X and Y coordinates of the mouse pointer relative to the current document. So if you say scroll horizontally by 10 pixels and then click in the top left corner, page X will be close to 10 and not 0 as it was with client X. And the third important one is screen X and screen Y. So these are the coordinates, you may have guessed it, relative to the screen. Of course, if the browser runs in full screen mode, then only the browser Chrome is basically added. But especially if the browser is not in full screen mode, then here the differences are of course pretty huge. So most of the time, client X, client Y, or page X, page Y is of interest, but not where on the big desktop screen the browser window currently happens to be, at least in most use cases. And there is a fourth set which I'd like to discuss. It's offset X and offset Y. Once again, X and Y coordinates, and this time relative to the target property of the event data or the event arguments. So the target DOM element. So if you click on the top left corner of a button and then capture that event and then have a look at the event data, offset X and offset Y are 0 or close to 0. So these are the most important, let's say, positional properties there are. Another set of interesting ones is button and buttons, singular and plural. So the button property contains the button which was pressed, because most mice have 2 or even 3 or even more buttons. Basically, the values are a bit weird, especially if we look at both options. So 0 is the main button. So usually it's the left button. But if you have a mouse for left-handed people where the left and right buttons are basically reversed, and then will be the right button. So the main button is 0 and the secondary button, so most of the time it's the right button, is 2, and the number in between 1 is, if possible or available, the middle button or the wheel button. So if you have a mouse wheel, you can click it, and so that would be 1. So 0 left, 2 is right, and 1 is in the middle. If you have extra buttons, the specification actually cares about 2 more extra buttons, and these have the numbers 3 and 4, but they are super rare in practice, obviously. It's a bit different with the buttons property, because as the name suggests, it also covers the use case that several buttons are clicked at the same time. And so the values are just added up, but to make this unique, they have 0 for no buttons, 1 for the left button, 2 for the right button, and then 4 for the wheel button if available, etc., etc. And so you add things up. So pressing the left and the right mouse button at the same time would be 1 plus 2 equals 3. In practice, it's rather rare that you work with other mouse buttons than the left one. And while pressing the mouse button, you can also determine whether any special keys were pressed. So the control key property is a Boolean property that returns whether the control key was pressed while that mouse event occurred. But there are others as well, like Alt key or Shift key and others. Control key is interesting because quite often pressing Control and clicking on, say, a link opens it up in a new tab. So maybe knowing that would allow us to possibly open up new content in a new tab as well, because the users might expect it. So these are the main additional mouse event arguments that we have access to. Let's also have a quick look at the X, Y coordinates that we can determine. So how about this? We write a quick helper function, and this helper function shows X, Y. Just log something to the console, the offset X and the offset Y values, and then we call it. So when the mouse enters the add to cart icon element, we add the CSS class, and then we just add an event listener for mouse move. And whenever the mouse moves, we would like to output the X and Y coordinates. And why did I put that in a specific named function? Because then once the mouse leaves the element, I can stop this. So I can remove the event listener again. So once again, we access e.target and then remove event listener. For the mouse move event, we'd like to get rid of the show XY listener. And that's it. In the browser, let's open up the DevTools, go to the console, and then I start moving over that icon, and you see that we get the position of the mouse pointer within, well, the padding of that icon. So that's why we don't get 0, 0 if I'm at the top left corner, but values that are a little bit higher because the link that contains that icon that provides the padding box here. And so we can find out where on that icon the mouse pointer currently is. There is one more use case for mouse events that is very specific, maybe even a little bit outside the scope of this course. Could be a course of its own, but still, I'd just like to show you within the context of our application, and that's drag and drop. There have been different attempts at specifying that. Before there was the specification, basically there were user-led implementations of drag and drop, so you wait for mouse events and then handle things and position elements. Now it's a little bit better, and I like to show you how that can be done. In the Global Ticket application, I would like to add the functionality to drag and drop events directly into the shopping cart. Wouldn't that be nice? Let's just implement it right away. There are 2 steps involved. First of all, I have to tell the events that they can be dragged. And then I have to tell the shopping cart that things can be dropped onto or into it. Let's start with the former. So here's the first table row representing the first event. And I just add the draggable attribute and I set it to true. So this now may be dragged. Out of the box, browser feature. No actual coding necessary. And I just have to make sure that this is part of each table row now. That being done, I have to make the drop zone work. The drop zone is the link. Actually, I am selecting the link to the shopping cart, which contains the add to shopping cart icon and the 0 ticket, 1 tickets, etc. text. I already have that, so since I need it again, how about I create a variable cart and put that in here and then just use the cart variable instead. And actually, since we already have event listeners for mouse enter and mouse leave for parts of that shopping cart thing, we could actually consider that we remove that variable and we attach that to the card here as well. So we have less elements with event listeners. But now, what do we need to do? There are a couple of events when it comes to drag and drop, and we will have to add event listeners for several of them. And the first one I'd like to cover is drag enter. It's like mouse enter, but this time not just the mouse is entering an element, but the mouse is currently also dragging something. And in that case, well, the default behavior is that the browser shows an error icon because dropping is not allowed if you drag something on the page and would like to drop it somewhere else on the page. How do we prevent the default behavior? Well, we've already seen that. We call prevent default, and that's it. And that's an important first step. The next event we add an event listener for is drag over. Drag over is like mouse over. So the mouse or the finger or whatever is moving over an element. It has already entered it, but it's also dragging something. Once again, we would like to get rid of the error icon. So we just call prevent default. All right. And now, what is the missing ingredient? The missing ingredient is what happens if we are dropping something. And this is pretty interesting because there is a way to pass data along with the stuff we are dropping. Let me show you. First of all, I'd like to add event handlers that actually send data along with the events that are dragged. How do I do that? And actually, I will do it up here. I'll first select all of the events. So document query selector all. And I select in the event table tbody tr. So I select all the table rows and then I iterate over them. And for each row, I add an event listener. And the event listener is for an event called drag start. Drag start means I start dragging that element. So what do I do when I start dragging an element? Well, the event arguments in that case have, among other things, a property called data transfer. That's basically an object that allows me to send structured data or just plain text. I would like to make it simple here, so I'm using plain text, and it works like this. I call the setData method, and first I provide the format. I just use plain text. I'm using the MIME type here, and then the value. I mean, there are different options what I could send. How about we access the element that's being dragged and use its inner text, because then later we can see whether we get the correct information. So when an event is dragged, this data is dragged along with the event. So the final step is when we are dropping that event, we have to make sure that this data is also now part of the mechanism. So how can we do that? Well, we have events for drag enter, drag over, and what happens if we let go an element that we are dragging while we are over an element? Well, we are adding an event listener, and this time for the drop event, we are dropping something. And when we do, there are a couple of things which we need to do. First of all, prevent default. That's always a good idea because you can also drag and drop from outside the browser, and the default behavior would be to open that. So prevent default, always a good idea here when dropping something. And then we could just have a look at the data. How about we just log it to the console? So data transfer. We had set data before, now it's get data, text/plain. And then, well, what happens if we drop something to the shopping cart? Remember, we don't have a real shopping cart. So before, when we clicked on the add to cart button, we basically incremented the number by 1 in our add to cart function. Let's just do that again here, just that we can prove that everything works as expected. The real proof, of course, is in the browser. So here we are. Let's open up the browser console. And then how about we take this element here, and you can see we are dragging it, but we can't drop it, arrow icon. But once we are over the shopping cart, we can drop it, and we have one ticket, and the console says, yeah, that was the Talk Docker to Me tour. So how about we try this again with another element? So how about the Code Empire tour once again, drag, drop, and in the console, we have here the Code Empire tour. And this was adding drag and drop functionality to our global ticket application. Let's turn our attention to keyboard events now. There are also a couple of things to know, and some of them are actually pretty weird if you ask me. There is the key down event, which basically means, okay, a key has been pressed down. So the finger is on the key, on the keyboard or on the on-screen keyboard, and the key is in a pressed down state. And then there is a follow-up event, so to speak, key press. So the key has been pressed. So what's the difference? Turns out that key press is, and it's really key press, not key pressed. Key press is only fired when we have letters, when we have digits, when we have things like commas, dots, etc. But not for specific keys like Shift or Control or F keys or arrow keys. There have been some browser differences, so it's rather inconvenient to use, but basically the event is there. So if you see it in code, you then can understand what it means. And eventually the key will need to be released again. And that's when the key up event is fired. As I mentioned, key press is not always fired because it depends a little bit on which key was pressed. And therefore there's, so to speak, a shortcut. So after key down, maybe only key up is following. My personal recommendation is avoid using key press because of subtle browser differences. Usually key up is what you want to do. So once a key is released, you take an action. Or if the action should be taken immediately when a key is pressed, say you implement a game or some navigation and you would like to work with the arrow keys, then key down is the way to go. When working with keyboard events, we are certainly interested in finding out which key was pressed. However, before we do that, it's important to understand, and this may already be obvious to you, but I just would like to mention it just in case, that there are different keyboard layouts. For instance, here we see a MacBook keyboard using a German keyboard layout, sometimes called the QWERTZ layout, because the top letter row starts with Q, W, E, R, T, and Z. So the Z and the Y change places, so to speak, when you compare it with, for instance, the US layout. Also, there are some, I would say, language-specific keys. For instance, the three letters here with the umlauts. So apart from QWERTZ, which we see here, or QWERTY, which is, for instance, used a lot in the US, there are also other keyboard layouts. This is an AZERTY keyboard or keyboard layout, popular in Belgium, France, and some other countries. And here, the Z, the Y, and the W kind of switch places. And why am I mentioning this? There are different approaches how to access which key was pressed. Of course, we are most of the time interested in the actual value. So if we press on something labeled with a Y, we would like to get the information, yes, someone entered a Y. But in other cases, we are interested in which of the hardware keys was pressed, no matter what the label is. So maybe the top left letter, and there could be a Q, but here it would be an A. So how do we handle that? We get access to different keyboard event data or keyboard event arguments, and here are four. We start with the code property. The code property contains a string representation of the hardware key. So for instance, key A, if I press the A, or if on a German keyboard layout, I press the Y, I get key Z or key Z, because from a hardware perspective, I just pressed the first key in the third row of letters, which on a German keyboard is a Y, but on a US keyboard, which basically serves as a blueprint, that's a Z. The next property is called key, but that's not the hardware key, but that's what you would see if you were, say, in a text editor and hit that key. So if I press on a Y on any keyboard layout, the key property would be a Y. If I hit Shift and Y, it would be an uppercase Y. So this is for receiving the text that would appear once the key or the key combinations would be pressed. In the code property, you can directly access pressing, say, the Control key or the Shift key, because you get a specific code for that. There are two more properties that sound very promising, but hear me out first. There's key code, which returns the ASCII code of the key that was pressed. That sounds okay, so we could use that and then convert it and then find out what the output of that key would be. However, that's deprecated, is or will be removed from browsers, so don't use it. And I mean, ASCII sounds pretty old and dated, right? How about Unicode? Well, there is the charcode property that does exactly that, so it returns the Unicode value of the key that was pressed. But once again, use is discouraged. If you're interested in what the output would be of a key that was pressed, use the key property instead. And if you're interested in the hardware key or in special keys like Shift or Control or one of the F keys, then use the code property. Handling key events in web applications, especially when special keys are involved, is relatively rare because it might also surprise users, which isn't always a good thing. Still, I'd like to show you, so how about we try to implement a simple undo operation in our global ticket application. So far, we have an event listener. When the user clicks on the first Add to Cart button, an element is added to the cart, and we have the once set to true option here, so that the event handler is only ran once. I'm removing that so that we can add an item multiple times to the shopping cart, and then we can undo that. We have the add to cart function, and the opposite will be the remove from cart function. Once again, we get our count, so get cart item count by basically reading it from the DOM. And then I set the text content not just to count -1. Why? Because then eventually that could turn negative. So how about we take the larger of count -1 and 0, so that the value can never get lower than 0. And now let's call this. So how about this? When we add an element to the shopping cart, we increment a counter, the undo counter. So undo counter is set to 0, and this will be increased whenever add to cart is called. So how about we do undo count ++. And then we would like to undo that later, and the typical key combination for undo is Control + Z or Z. So how about we add an event listener to that? And here's how we can do that. We add an event listener for the whole document, and we could either choose key down or key up. But what happens if we hold the key for a while? Then key down might be fired multiple times. So let's just use key up. And then let's have a look at what key was pressed. And there are two options which we are interested in, or two pieces of information. Was the Z or Z pressed, and was the Control key pressed at the same time? So we first look at the key property, and if that is a Z, and if also the control key was pressed at the same time, then we know, it's control Z. Maybe there is some default behavior in the browser and maybe we can prevent it. And of course, it's up to the browsers what they are doing. Some browsers do not want specific key combinations be overridden, like Control P or everything that would close the browser or close a browser tab. So just by good measure, let's prevent the default behavior. And then if the undo count is still positive, then we decrease it by 1. And then we call remove from cart. Let's try this out. So I'm adding 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tickets to the shopping cart. And now I hit Control Z. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. And I'm still trying to press Control Z, Control Z, Control Z. Nothing happens because we have already reached 0. One specific type of both events and DOM access is still missing: HTML forms. So we could, for instance, do an automated JavaScript-based validation of a form. And that will be up next in our final module.